Are you a political hobbyist? Do you read the Hill Times or iPolitics just for fun? How about tuning into the Sunday morning talk shows? Chatting about politics with friends or family, just like if you were talking about your favorite sports team? Well, if you are, you might be hurting democracy. Welcome back to inFocus with David Coletto. I'm David Coletto. On this episode of inFocus, I'm joined by Eitan Hersh, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Tufts University. His research focuses on civic participation, voting rights, and the relationship between election rules, strategies, and the behavior of voters. In 2020, he published his second book, Politics is for Power, a groundbreaking analysis of political hobbyism, treating politics like a spectator sport, and an urgent and timely call to arms for the many well-meaning, well-informed citizens who follow political news but do not take political action. In this interview, we discussed his research and the findings of his book and what they mean for American and Canadian politics and the future of our democracies. I hope you find my interview with Dr. Hersh useful and informative. Well, Dr. Hersh, thank you so much for joining the podcast and taking some time to talk about your research in your book. I just finished it for the second time in preparing for our conversation and thought it challenged my thinking. It introduced new ideas that are so obvious, I think, at first, but then I don't think have been articulated in the way that you had. And so thanks for being here. Good to see you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the base, I guess, and that is you introduce a concept in your book, which I had not heard framed this way, but makes complete sense now that you've described it. Political hobbyists. What are they, and why write a book that really targets them and focuses on them?
So I'll answer the second part of your question first. When I was starting to write this book, I did so in part because I saw a huge disconnect between the politics of the people I knew around me, friends, family, neighbors, versus the politics that I teach. I'm a political scientist, so I teach about how things get done in government. Who has power? What do they do with it? And when I looked all around me at a fairly intense moment of politics in the United States, I think, I saw people spending an hour or two a day thinking about politics, but without any strategy. There was no goal. It was more like just a consumption activity. You follow a team, you follow facts, you learn statistics, you go to Nate Silver's blog who tells you what percentage point chance the party has to win. You read a lot of news and then comment on the news. And so you're like an amateur pundit yourself. And I just thought to myself, none of this is politics. This is just much closer to sports fandom, or the example I like using because it's more relevant to my family is foodies who follow restaurants or recipes. It wasn't real. It wasn't real. So I wanted to write a book that was about this phenomenon of political hobbyism, which is sort of just a catch-all term for doing politics for your own satisfaction, like satisfying an emotional need you have to feel connected or an intellectual desire you have to learn factoids, versus doing politics as the pursuit of power, which is a term power. People are uncomfortable with that idea. What does it mean to pursue power? But you want control of the government if you're in politics. You want to be able to convey your values through the democratic process, and to do that, you need to win elections and have control of public hearings and all sorts of stuff. That's what politics is all about. So the book's about that disconnect, and also it's targeting, of course, the hobbyists who else would read a book about politics but a
Right.
political hobbyist, trying to move people from this domain of consumption, just self-satisfying emotional intellectual desire, to a place of strategy and channeling that emotion and that energy into something that's useful for their cause that they believe in.
So then in your book, and in articles you've written in or a piece you wrote in Atlantic Magazine when your book was released, you argue that political hobbyists you believe have harmed democracy. And then obviously would do better by redirecting that energy towards, as you said, material, emotional needs of their neighbors, trying to gain power, trying to influence, not through social media, but on the ground, meeting people and getting to know them. And you lay out the reasons why you think. We'll talk about whether this group has grown over time and why they've developed, but why do you think that, political hobbyism, let's say, that is hurting American democracy, and I suspect Canadian democracy and democracy around the world?
Right. I mean, so number one is that if you believe, as I do, that there's like a lot of problems that our democracy needs to solve, then all of these people spending their time doing basically nothing is a real shame. I mean, people don't have endless hours of free time. So the fact that you have people spending an hour or two a day, and then when you survey them, as I did, 95% of them do not engage in any kind of strategic behavior. You feel like, wow, this is a lot of people wasting their time and not responding to very serious problems. Early in the book, right in the introduction, actually, I give this example of strategic behavior, and I use the Ku Klux Klan as the example. So the Ku Klux Klan, in just a couple of years ago, was seen in North Carolina, which is a swing state in American politics, basically running an opioid clinic. So they were going around to people and saying, you have an opioid addiction, it's not your fault, we're here to help you. And I tell that story in the intro of the book because I want people to understand the stakes, that when they are like just, flicking through their phone, liking things and arguing with people about like dumb polling averages, white nationalist extremists, who I assume they don't like, are out on the street running an opioid clinic and winning over supporters. So the stakes are actually very high for people doing nothing. And what we see through evidence in the book is that the people who are most likely to be political hobbyists are the people who are most comfortable, upper middle class, college educated, they have jobs. They could say, oh yeah, climate change is a big problem, I'm afraid of this, I'm afraid of that. But they don't really feel serious stakes in politics, and that's why they're engaging in political hobbyism. So one major reason why this is bad is all of these people who have the time to spend on politics are instead spending it on a game. But it's worse than that. As I talk about, there are certain areas of political hobbyism, at least in the American context, where the hobbyists are making things worse, actively making things worse. So I use our donation system in the United States as an example of this. There's been a huge increase in low-dollar donations in American politics, where people are basically, through, one-click technology, they see some viral video and they give $5 here and there. And one thing that's become very clear in the data on low-dollar donations is that low-dollar donations tend to go to candidates who are extreme and provocative. It's why Donald Trump was so good at raising low-dollar donations. He raised more low-dollar donations than his liberal opponents raised. Because every time there was a provocative, he was very good at making provocative videos, and basically people, and by the way, some people on the left, like, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, these people raise a lot of money in low-dollar donations too. And what they're doing is they're making a video or sending something of themselves, like ripping someone else down. And people feel a sense of catharsis by seeing a politician do that. And so they give money because that makes them feel good. And so what you have is all this money going to candidates who are extreme, basically, and provocative, and it's creating an incentive in the political system that if you want to have easy money, you just say some outlandish thing. And we've seen our politicians turn everything from, congressional hearings to town hall meetings to campaign stops into opportunities for them to make a viral video. And I think that for many of us, myself included, that's kind of damaging to the system.
And we see that in Canada too. Our not all, but most of the major political parties, if you follow them on Twitter, you wonder, who are they speaking to? Because most voters would look at that content and say, that is not a party that seems mainstream or wants to try to win a lot of voters over, yet they're only speaking to their party members and activists who are hobbyists, large part, and need you're right, that dopamine hit of like anger or engagement that it creates. So and we also, like, our parties rely on small donations too. We've got pretty tight limits in Canada, so the incentives are exactly the same, I think, and so there's a lot of overlap there. What do you think it does political hobbyists? So you really lay it out really, I think, effectively in the book to show how all the moving parts kind of respond. So the media has some, impact on this because they want this audience. They need this audience. Like, this is the quote political junkies who are watching, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC, or cable news generally, consistently and often. And then there's other institutions that are playing a role. But what do you think the impact is of, I guess, political hobbyism on non-hobbyists, right? On those that you said aren't as comfortable and are actually seeking change to improve things or their own place in the world. Does it have bigger impacts on trust in the system itself and how, everybody else sees these institutions and the people that are in them as being kind of out of touch and only talking to a very small audience that are playing a game, as opposed to, trying to do things in the real world?
Yeah, so I would say that at the sub-national level, like in state and local politics, politicians generally just get a big pass because the hobbyists are interested in national, like left versus right, good guy versus bad guy kind of politics. And, that's why you have people who will say they spend 2 hours a day on politics, okay, consuming political news. But if you ask them anything below the national level, they don't even know the names of their representatives. They never vote in those elections because they don't know anything about what's going on in their state and local communities. And of course, it's not, at least in American politics, because it's kind of small potato stuff at the state and local level. We have a huge amount of power that goes through our states. And so, if you say your biggest issue is economic development, if you say it's infrastructure, if you say it's race relations and funding of minority schools, if you say it's climate change, and you're ignoring the state house, you're making a big mistake. So in some sense, the hobbyists give a pass to all of the people who work in state and local government because they don't pay attention to them. And the hobbyists have no idea how things work. I mean, how does a bill become a law in a state house? Who has power? How do you get leverage? Hobbyists don't think about things like this. They think about national politics. I think that there is a major problem. So the answer to one part of your question is, if you're a state legislator, you can more or less ignore the hobbyists because they don't vote in your elections, and you can just carry on. Now, a lot of people, particularly people who are, say, on the far left or on the left or the right, they shouldn't want to ignore the lawmakers because lawmakers tend to be more moderate, business oriented, and so forth. So, they kind of ignore them at their peril, but it's not bad for the lawmakers themselves. It is, however, bad, the hobbyism is, for people who are not that engaged in politics at all right now. I mean, we have a bigger problem with this than you have in Canada, but you have some sort of a problem with it as well, which is like we don't have, great turnout rates. We have a lot of people who are totally disengaged. And one hypothesis about why so many people are disengaged is that they look at politics as just this circus that us versus them, good versus bad, and it's gross. You kind of want to take a shower. I mean, if I go on to Boston sports radio and listen to people fighting about who the Patriots coach should have played in this third quarter, I would think to myself, my God, like this is terrible. What a horrible sport. People are, getting upset about the dumbest things and they're yelling at each other, and it's not. That's how most people would listen to any sports talk show or any kind of political talk show, anything about politics that's geared to hobbyists. Like it's not about real stuff. It's just people fighting. I think when politics is much more about like meat and potatoes debates, like, should we build this bridge? Should we fund this thing? Do we want to tax people to pay for this? it's not as exciting to the hobbyists, but it's like real life. And so I think that we are turning off people to politics when we make everything into, a nationalized us versus them brawl.
What's the impact on the parties themselves? I mean, in the U.S., political party is a little different in terms of its structure. It's so amorphous and everywhere in your lives than it is here in Canada. But you wrote, that political hobbyists, quote, might front as allies on social media, but very few, and you use the example of white liberals, are actively engaging in face-to-face political organizations, committing their time to fighting for racial equality or any other issue they say they care about. Add climate change to that, given that we're just coming out of COP26 and that issue's on the agenda. So if you've got all of these, quote, hobbyists who see themselves as activists, but actually aren't active in anything other than, typing out a few digits and talking a lot about this, how are political parties in the US and then elsewhere, I think you can apply, reacting? Like, how is it affecting their own behavior and structure and the way that then they engage with the broader public?
Yeah, so basically the political parties have to just try to get people's attention when they can, because the hobbyists are very, they get tired of things quickly. The hobbyists aren't in it for the long haul. So, you give an example. Last year, we had these major protests over Black Lives Matter and police reform, and a lot of people were out in the streets. Something like the majority of Democrats or something like that, a huge number of Democrats said they engaged in a protest. And I was doing a lot of, talks about my book and interviews. People would say, oh, is that hobbyism, going to a Black Lives Matter rally? And my reaction was, well, it kind of depends what happens next. I mean, are you just going because it's a sunny Saturday and you get to feel good about yourself? Because what happens at those rallies is that someone up front is saying, thank you for coming. This is step one. Step two is we actually need you to show up to a town hall meeting and a select board meeting and a city council meeting. And we need to remind the lawmakers that you care about this issue. And we need you to vote in the next election, in the local election, where we usually have 10% turnout. We need you there to say that this issue is important to you. Now, if you went to one of those rallies and you're a Democrat and you say you care about those issues, and that was the beginning and end of your engagement, you didn't do any of those things, then yeah, that's hobbyism. You did that for yourself. Now, if it was the first step into some deeper engagement, then no, right? So the issue is, like, right now, what we're seeing is you go to a town hall meeting now, you go to a school board meeting now, and those liberals are gone. Those meetings are entirely overrun by folks who are now there, who are on the right and interested in getting rid of mask mandates and opposing critical race theory. And you see this cycle again from, say, you could do the same story a decade ago. Democrats get excited about Barack Obama, and they say healthcare is the most important thing we have. Obama gets elected, Democrats get elected with this huge overwhelming majority. They pass universal healthcare, and then there starts to be town hall meetings, and the Democrats are gone. And then the Republicans get organized. The Republicans take over Congress. The Republicans take over, the Supreme Court. And where were the Democrats? Did they care about it or not? And the Republicans, by the way, are the opposite. I mean, if you're a conservative, you can tell exactly the same story, but in the opposite. So you go through these cycles because the hobbyists are not actually committed to any strategy or any policy goals. They just are willing to show up when it's fun or when it's gratifying. So what is this party supposed to do with that? A party needs to actually be in it for the long haul. They need to win those midterm elections and local elections, or else they can't enact their policy agenda. So yeah, I mean, it's just a very big problem for parties.
So this, it all sounds as though, underlying your thesis and the story you're telling in this book, it's really a story about the decline of community organizing among large parts of sort of the American political system, particularly on, I would say, the progressive left, right? Like when you think about the fact that in your book, you highlight who are political hobbyists. Well, they're typically older. They are more likely to be men, but they are also more likely to be self-identified Democrats and progressive kind of oriented, highly educated people, and they're white, right? Generally speaking, not that's the average. And you think about the history of even the Democratic Party and community organizing, like to me, that sounds like what's happening is you're seeing a decline there. And so, as you said, groups that are still on the kind of out, they're not comfortable, they don't have the privilege of being educated and white and well off, are filling in the gaps that are being left and organizing themselves, and they're kind of winning because they're winning power and they're electing folks and they're getting folks on the Supreme Court, as you described. Is that in essence the story, that like the implication of this from a public policy outcome perspective?
I mean, I think what you see is that you still have power goes to people who are organized, right? So, I mean, I think that there are elements of the Democratic and Republican parties that are organized. You know, unions are very small compared to what they used to be, but they can pack a punch because they can get people out to vote and to organize and all that. I mean, churches, you know, which has become increasingly a right-wing thing in American politics. I mean, it's increasingly associated with the political right, where the church itself doesn't have to be political at all. But the fact that 1,000 people or 100 people know each other in a community and can leverage those social ties for a political or civic purpose, that's very powerful. I mean, and I say that as a religious person myself. I mean, before an election, I can send an email to 100 people and in my own neighborhood and say, here's who you should vote for the local election. And they say, thank you very much. I didn't know about, you know, any of these races. I appreciate it. And that's like a division of labor in a community. Because, like, you know, if one of them's a nurse or a doctor and my kid breaks their ankle, I'm not going to solve it myself. I'm going to go to them. And they come to political scientists, you know, about politics. Like, that's how civil society works. And I think for a huge number of liberals, that just doesn't exist for them. And it used to, right? I mean, it used to, because most people were in religious communities, and particularly on the left, now they're not. So that's one implication. I mean, the second thing you're saying, in particular as it relates to race, is that the story of race in the book, I tell a little bit differently. I think it's about stakes. So that what you still see in American politics today is that the people who really actually feel the most threatened, that the issues are personal and matter for their lives, actually do politics in a real way. And so you see, for example, racial minority groups, even though they spend less overall time like consuming political news, end up spending more time than white Americans volunteering for organizations, because they're, you know, in many cases, they're organizing for really like concrete things. Education for their children, you know. And so if you're in a upper middle class, comfortable life, you have a good job, your kids are in a good school district, maybe the stakes are not particularly high for you, so you just treat politics instead like a hobby.
I'm sure people listening are going to ask, and I always get asked, is this new, or was this the case in, you know, the 1950s or the 60s? And in the book, you make the case that no, this is something relative, not new, but it's becoming more frequent, and there's more political hobbyists than there were in the past. What's the evidence that you found that supports the idea that this is becoming a bigger problem as opposed to one that's always existed?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so we've had, say, since the 1950s, that's what you mentioned, is like we've had this obviously well-known and well-reported decline of civil society, of organized life, right? So, like, you know, I have some overtime graphs or stats in the book. It's like we have more people than ever saying that the election is critical, of deep importance, but fewer than ever saying they are a member of an organization or did any volunteering. Most people who spend an hour or 2 hours a day on politics belong to 0 organizations, have attended 0 meetings in the last year, have worked with others 0 times on any kind of civic and political thing. So we have this decline of civil society, and we have not had, even in the Trump era, a big increase in actual organized engagement. You know, another big trend, of course, is social media, which makes this a bit different, where people have this avenue to spend so much time becoming essentially an amateur pundit, and they get to channel their political energy that way, as opposed to through organized political activity. So I think there's a technological change. There's the civil society change, and then there's kind of the collapse of party organizations. I mean, political parties have changed. Politics has changed because it's become more nationalized. Um, uh, Local party committees, which used to have some amount, good amount of power, say in the 1950s. I mean, had a huge amount of power. Local political parties in the 1950s were in charge of choosing nominees for president. And today, like in the 1950s rules, someone like Donald Trump would never have been a nominee because voters didn't get to decide who was the nominee. Party leaders got to decide. And then over time, in the spirit of democratization, we've liberalized how we choose our nominees for party endorsements. We've liberalized the donation rule, so we encourage people to give $5 donations. And all of this democratization has been fuel for hobbyists who kind of want to engage in a kind of DIY way, but not through any organized strategic organization.
Are there structural factors that help explain this? I was just as you were talking there, I was thinking about, increasing inequality, so economic and social inequality that I think might exacerbate, the divide between the hobbyists and everybody else, right? There's this reoccurring theme that there's this, you described it earlier in our conversation, there's a comfort, being comfortable is kind of the definition of being able to afford to be a political hobbyist, because you don't have, the stakes aren't high, you don't have to actually, hit the ground running, you have time. Time is the most valuable resource, and if you have lots of it, you can spend time watching Rachel Maddow every night, or scrolling through your Twitter feed, because heck, you don't have to work 2 jobs or anything else that you need to do. Is there, and maybe this is going beyond your actual book, but as you've been engaged and talked about sort of the findings, are there, in your sense, structural problems that are exacerbating this in your mind that might lead to either a solution to it or can help solve for the issues you've identified?
Well, I mean, I think there are ways to make party organizations stronger, getting more money to having robust local political parties. Basically making local civil society stronger is important, whether that's through better funding for nonprofit local journalism, to getting people involved in a political party that does more than just fight about politics. I give all these examples in the book about parties that, give out free turkeys and childcare and try to do real things for people so that people have more of a connection. I mean, I think especially for younger people who tend to be much more mobile and to be much less religious, there is a sense in which they don't have a home base and they don't have any kind of neighborhood. And that stuff is really important to keeping people engaged year in, year out. I mean, the problem is that people are only getting energized in a cyclical way, right? So right now we see that Democrats have control over Congress. So of course it's the Republicans' turn to get organized. Democrats sit home, right? My students who were I work on a liberal college campus. So my students were, volunteering and doing stuff when last cycle when Biden was on and now the Democrats have won, they're sitting at home. They're not going to go canvass anymore. They're not going to go volunteer anymore because things are okay enough right now. And then the Republicans will take over Congress because they're super jazzed about this now. And then we'll go through it all again, and hopefully the country doesn't collapse at some point. So that's kind of where we are. What happens when you have an actual robust, localized civil society is that people can stay involved year in, year out because they're not energized by a celebrity on the ballot.
Right.
They're energized
and it seems to me that the aggregate of that would be more stability. You would have fewer kind of swings where you'd go from a swing election in which you'd elect all these Democrats and then swing all the way back to Republicans, and a little more stability because you have people actively engaged all the time.
Yep. They don't have to be actively engaged. I mean, when you think about the think about the 100 people I sent
Somewhat engaged.
my email to, right? The thing is, and this is important, right? The reason why my 100 friends are going to vote in a local election is not because of who's on the ballot, and it's not because what time of year it is. It's because they don't want to let me down because I'm their friend. And when politics operates like that, some people don't like that, by the way. They think, oh, how gross. People are voting just because of who their friend is or who's some local leader, and that could be abused and whatever. But the alternative is what we have now, which is that no one votes unless there's a celebrity on their ballot and it's a fun time to vote.
Or becomes the thing to do at that moment, and then it loses cachet. In reading your book, I couldn't help but feel, as a pollster, somewhat responsible for feeding and encouraging political hobbyism. I imagine most of the visitors to my website, when we put out a poll during the last Canadian election, for example, were going there because they wanted to, like I would as a kid, open up the newspaper and read the box scores for baseball. They just wanted to see the stats, who's up, who's down. We don't often have daily tracking in Canada, but during elections we do. And it's like this daily fix of, 1 point increase, 1 point. Have you thought about sort of, it didn't come up very often in your book, but the role that kind of polls play? You mentioned Nate Silver and kind of the aggregators. Thoughts on how the polls feed this kind of behavior, and I can't imagine you're going to have good thoughts to say, but I would be remiss not to talk about it given what I do.
I appreciate you asking it, and for sure, like when my book came out, Nate Silver tweeted something like, "Oh, this is a very judgmental take," I think there's two ways to think about it. I mean, there's the way to think about it from the producer of this content versus the consumer of it. So, from the producer side, I would say two things. One is that there are some polling information that does inform people's decisions about what they do, and some polling information that really doesn't. And, the public is starved for information about local elections and other issues that they care about. And to the extent that you can use the polls that are already going out to ask questions that really help people concretely learn information that can inform their decisions is good. I would say the other thing is that I am very sympathetic to the view that, if you're a firm, then you're trying to make money, and what brings you clicks or money is polling. Then okay, you need to have that on your website, but you better also supplement that with actually useful information that is good for the world. So I think that. And I've talked to pollsters in the U.S. who basically, this is what they think. They have to do the polling because that's what people want, but then they try as much as they can to shift people's attention to more important things. I think in general, though, and I'll tell you how I react to this stuff, which is that as a political scientist who studies U.S. elections, you can imagine how often I'm asked about what's my take on the latest poll. Mm-hmm. And I would say starting around 3 or 4 years ago, I don't talk about that kind of politics anymore. I'm never gonna say yes to an interview about talking about something that I think is for hobbyists. How someone did in a debate, what a poll says. If you want to talk about politics, to me, then we're going to talk about organizing. We're going to talk about politicians. We're going to talk about power and strategy, and we need to kind of change the whole discourse around this so that the public is more interested in more important things, frankly, than a daily polling average.
It's so true. I mean, and I appreciate that perspective, and I do kind of personally feel that need to do good things with the power that I have to ask people questions as opposed to just feeding the horse race beast all the time. But just to your point about sometimes, and I want to end with another last question, but I was thinking about the Canadian political world, which is not much different from what we see in the US. I don't think we're as aggressively partisan or biased in some of the cable news, but there's still some of it there. But there's this obsession with the tactics of politics. You described how did somebody do in the debate? And that becomes a whole 45-minute segment on a show. Most people don't, unless you're a political hobbyist, have any interest in that. In the same way that if you're not a baseball fan, you don't care how someone's, pitching stats have evolved, or anyways, I haven't watched a lot of baseball recently, so I can't even think of an example, but you know what I mean. So I guess I want to end our conversation with the so what do we do about this, I guess. And your book is as much I think an analysis of the situation as it is almost like a call to arms to say, okay, political hobbyists, if you do care about the state of your country, if someone like Donald Trump or Barack Obama on either side of the political spectrum gets you riled up and gets you tweeting about it, you got to actually do something. Is that, so what's the solution then that you see as, and it's the solution, I mean, like, what do you want people like me and other hobbyists listening to this to actually do in order not to see the impacts of this prevail over the long term?
Yeah, so obviously, depending on where you sit, whether you're in media, whether you're in government, or a regular person, regular citizen, the answer is going to be a little different. I really did gauge the book to like the regular citizen, and who I think often wants to deflect blame. They say, it's not my fault, it's the media's fault, or it's rich people's fault, or it's the institutions of government's fault. And I find all that very convenient. I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff you can do, and so a big part of the book is telling these stories of people who did it differently and actually think about playing a long game. How much can you do if you try hard over a period of 5 years, a period of 10 years? And it's really shocking. I mean, really, since writing this book, I personally have gotten involved in local issues and have made like serious concrete changes in my community on issues like housing and policing. It's not because I'm some kind of genius strategist. It's because I worked with others. I had a strategy, and I was able to influence government. And you could say a hobbyist be like, oh, well, that's just one town. Well, actually, no. If people in every town did these things, then we could solve a massive housing crisis, or we could solve a crisis of education. Your job is not to like fix everything in the whole country. It's to like do your part. And so I think like long-term institutional engagement is part of that. The other thing is like being an adult about how things are supposed to work. So, I mean, it's just an attitude towards government that I think is really weird, that people have. Sometimes compromises are supposed to happen in secret. Like sometimes like politicians need space to hash out a deal. And you, the voter, don't need to be privy to every single thing. You could actually defer to a leader at some point in your life, whether it's who to vote for or when to get involved. The idea that every voter should individually be doing research and opining about everything, and they expect every politician to be public about every conversation they have, like, that is just a childish view of decision making. So I think we need to have like a different view about politics, and also different activities we do where like I try to give people in the book some guideposts. How do I know if I'm doing it right? And so one really simple one, and maybe we can leave with this, is that I ask people who are spending time on politics, is anyone counting on you? Is anyone counting on you? So if you are on social media, for example, tweeting or whatever, and you stopped for a week or 2 weeks, is anyone going to say, hey, Joe, we miss you so much, all your hot takes? Probably not, because no one's actually counting on you, because you're not doing anything for them. You're doing something for yourself. But if you're a part of a legitimate organization and you are having a strategy for influencing the government, and you ghosted them, your peers, they would be like, hey, Joe, we missed you. We needed you there. Not only is that like probably good for your soul that people need you and want you, but that's a good sign that you're doing something that's useful because other people are depending on you.
I think that's a great way to end it. And I agree with you on the soul piece, that if you don't have somebody depending on you or counting on you, it's probably a lonely existence. And so if you can surround yourself with people who count on you to show up, you're probably going to feel a lot better about yourself too. And heck, I think after coming out of this pandemic, I think that could be a nice change to things. Well, Eitan, this has been a great time, great chat. Your book is Politics is for Power: How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change. Highly recommend it, and really appreciate your time today.
My
Great
pleasure.
great
Thanks
to
for
meet
having
you.
me. Okay, take care.